So yes, that's the title that I um, chose. So it's about paradigm shifts and the idea of progress in cultural evolution. Um, and I suppose to start by grounding it in the idea of a second renaissance, which is kind of what we're about. Um, so the idea of paradigms is quite central to the way that the second renaissance is framed in the white papers. Um, so there's this idea of evolving paradigms. So this image on the right hand side is from the white papers. Um, so the idea of cultural paradigms is mentioned quite a lot, and this is traced back to integral theory and the spiral dynamics model from Graves, Beck, and Cowan, which is sort of what's represented by that spiral movement in the image on the right-hand side. And so a kind of core idea is that culture evolves across these different paradigms. So starting from hunter-gatherer to classical to a pre-modern stage to modernity, then post-modernity and metamodernity is one way of looking at the different stages. And it sort of makes sense, at least loosely, to call these paradigms and to think of the transition between these stages as paradigm shifts. And in addition to spiral dynamics and Wilbur, there's this idea of metamodernism here, which again is referenced in the white papers. But even aside from the sort of second Renaissance framing, in general discussions of metamodernism, you have this idea of metamodernism as a paradigm shift moving beyond modernism and postmodernism. And I think the question I want to focus on in this talk is the question of progress, which I think is sort of less explicitly discussed a lot of the time, but it's kind of assumed that at least in the latest phase of the transition, when you're transitioning to metamodernism or to the second Renaissance, there is, in some sense, a progress occurring, that it's not just a sort of value neutral shift from one paradigm to another, but some kind of progress is occurring. And then so there's the question of what do we mean by that, and how can we justify that idea that culture is progressing and not just evolving in some neutral way. So what I also want to do is in this talk is connect this idea of paradigms to some of the philosophy of science literature around paradigms, where progress is also discussed. And I guess part of the idea is both to improve our understanding of what paradigms mean in this context, but also there's, I think, a sort of practical benefit of connecting ideas that we talk about in the Second Renaissance with more mainstream academic literature. It's sort of, I guess, can help with adoption of these kind of ideas, for example, by policymakers to have those links to the mainstream. So that's another one of my aims in this talk. And I should say that this is not a fully worked out thesis that I'm proposing here. It's very much exploring some of these ideas, and yeah, very interested to hear people's thoughts on how best to present these, what angle to come at these from in sort of future blog posts I might write, or etc. So yeah, like I say, I want to sort of look at the origin of this idea of paradigms in philosophy of science. And so the idea of paradigm shifts, and even paradigms more generally, can really be traced back to one thinker, Thomas Kuhn, in his book Structure of Scientific Revolutions. It's sort of quite relatively unusual for an idea that's become so popular to be so clearly originated by a single quite academic thinker, but this really seems to be the case with the case of paradigm shifts. So he essentially coins this term in this book, which is major work in 20th century philosophy of science, very influential across a variety of different traditions, interestingly. So both the sort of analytic Anglo-American philosophy of science, but also more sort of continental European approaches. They both sort of draw from Kuhn's work. And in this book, he defines a paradigm as essentially a sort of standard way of doing science. So this is entirely focused on science now, not culture more generally. So the idea is in the history of science, you have certain fairly static periods where science proceeds normally. This is what Kuhn calls normal science. And there's a sort of narrower and a wider sense of paradigm that he uses. So the narrow sense is the kind of original meaning of the word paradigm is as a template for something. So his idea is that specific work or specific experiment, like Newton's Principia, can be taken as a template for a whole way of doing science in a society, in a period. And so within that sort of and that way of doing science as a whole is the broader sense of paradigm he suggests. So Newtonian science is a paradigm, and relativistic science would be another paradigm, for example. And so the idea is there's a sort of standard way of doing things that all scientists more or less adopt. They work within a particular framework, and that allows them to make progress within that framework. There's a set of problems that get resolved and addressed within that framework. And I guess the key thing for today is this idea of paradigm shifts. So he looks at the history of science and how you move from Newton to Einstein, for example. And the idea is that there are certain anomalies that usually show up in a existing paradigm. Certain things that just can't be understood within the paradigm, and those anomalies would multiply and increase. The problems can't be resolved until you get to a point of crisis, where people are really starting to sort of doubt the paradigm. They're starting to think maybe a new paradigm is required, and then someone comes up with a new template or paradigm in the narrow sense that can create a new paradigm. And there are obvious resonances here with the idea of a second renaissance as responding to a crisis in modernity. And sort of anomalies, particular specific crises adding up, becoming a polycrisis, and that being impetus towards a larger cultural shift. And in terms of the idea of progress, this is sort of one of the more contentious aspects of Kuhn's work. And in a sense, when I mentioned that the multiple traditions drawing on his work, part of the divergence there is that they take different views of what Kuhn's work means for progress. So the more postmodern traditions tend to take him as essentially showing that there is no objective progress between paradigms, that there's no sort of objective way in which we can say that Einstein's relativistic physics is better than Newton's, for example. Whereas in the Anglo-American tradition, it's more seen as a problem with his work that they've tried to resolve in later philosophy of science. But actually, there is some sense in which we can justify treating that progress from Newton to Einstein as actual genuine progress. And so this is what I'm suggesting, basically a way into thinking about progress for cultural paradigm shifts as well. And so we're kind of assuming here that you can apply this idea of paradigm shifts to culture more generally. And that's, potentially a controversial idea. I mean, in a loose way, obviously, we can speak about it that way, but there's a question of, can Kuhn's specific sense of a paradigm, which he applies only to science, can that be applied more broadly to culture? I think that there's good reasons to think that it can. I've shown some pictures of some books there at the bottom where people are applying it in specific ways to morality, theology, aesthetics. And I think that the sort of broader way of understanding how it can be applied more broadly is through the idea of evolution. So this is something that Kuhn himself talks about in his book, and others talk about in relation to him, that evolution of scientific frameworks is a bit like biological evolution. And in certain strands of evolutionary theory today, we have this idea of punctuated equilibrium, which is the idea that you have an equilibrium in a sort of evolutionary system, a certain ecosystem where species are fairly static, and then suddenly you get a shift. That's the sort of point or punctuation where the whole ecosystem changes, and you get a significant change to a new species or new ecosystem, and that's similar to Kuhn's theory of paradigm shifts. And so, that also brings in this idea of mimetic evolution as well, which is quite common in spiral dynamics too. We talk about sort of value memes, for example, thinking of culture as composed of a number of memes that evolve through a quasi a process similar to biological evolution with variation and selection going on. And so there's this paper, for example, at the top right, that explores that idea and looks at the idea of epistasis, which is sort of the way that specific memes hang together. If there's a number of memes that sort of fit together nicely, then that can explain certain features of the way cultures evolve from a mimetic point of view, is the idea there. So I think I'm not going to sort of explore these ideas further, but that there are good reasons for thinking that actually this specific Kuhnian approach can be applied to culture more broadly. So going back to the question of progress, so within metamodernism itself, there is some discussion of this. So this is these images are from Brendan Graham Dempsey's book, Metamodernism, where he talks about the idea of sort of expanding the circle and decentering as a kind of progress. So the idea is you start with being this star within a circle or sort of sphere of experience, and then you kind of decenter yourself so that you're outside the experience that you're originally in. You're sort of able to observe that experience from the outside, or it might be a sort of cultural situation that you're able to sort of distance yourself from and look at from the outside, and that gives you that sort of higher level perspective, and could be seen as a kind of progress in that sense. And so, of course, even when you're outside, you're still within the middle of a new circle. You're not looking at things from nowhere. It's not a view from nowhere. It's still centered within some kind of cultural point of view, and that gets expanded by him to this idea of sort of concentric circles, where you move from pre-modern to modern, post-modern, and metamodern in that way. And this is a way of thinking about the transcend and include approach that gets discussed in integral theory. Because in a sense, what you're doing is, these circles are literally included within the circle you're currently in. And yeah, on the top right there, we've got an image showing that actually a similar approach has been used in relation to spiral dynamics as well. And I think this is a nice way of thinking about it, but it's a little bit metaphorical, and it would be nice to have a more theoretical understanding of what this involves. And so this is where I'm suggesting that, looking at this philosophy of science literature can be helpful. So thinking about Kuhn himself for a moment, as I've said, he's kind of been criticized for being ambiguous on this issue of progress. People read him one way or the other, or you can read him as being sort of essentially ambiguous, and I think he is. I think one way of understanding the apparent contradictions there is that he's sort of unconsciously trying to get to a metamodernist position, because on the one hand, he says that the move from one paradigm to another is can't be considered objective progress, because you're really just moving from one world to another. There's a sort of Newtonian world and the Einsteinian world, for example. And that would suggest that there's no, true progress going on. But on the other hand, he says things like that actually the new approach does solve more problems than the previous approach. And that seems to be, quite an objective sense in which it does constitute progress. And I think that what he's trying to do is find a middle position between, a fully objective sense of progress, and complete relativism on the other hand. And I think that's what metamodernists try and do as well. So Freinacht, for example, has the idea of relative progress or relative utopia in his book, The Nordic Ideology. The idea being that you can see a paradigm shift as genuinely solving problems that were there in the previous paradigm, but you also recognize that the new paradigm has lots of problems inevitably of its own and will need to be itself superseded in a future paradigm. So I think what I want to suggest is, there is a similarity there between Kuhn and metamodernism. But if we look at some of the work in the philosophy of science that happens after Kuhn, particularly in the Anglo-American tradition, there are some useful ideas that help us, again, get beyond the metaphor and understand what the progress might consist in. And so, I just want to suggest that this idea of structural realism may be helpful here. So this, again, comes out of thinking about physics, but can be applied more broadly. So again, the Newton-Einstein example, I think, is quite helpful here. If you look at the images there, you can kind of get a sense of how just in physical mathematical terms, Newton's physics does kind of approximate Einstein's physics, but with relativity, you just are able to solve some additional problems, for example, around GPS systems and needing to adjust for time dilation when you're close to a gravity well like the Earth, which is what GPS systems are actually having to do in today's world. And so that's a problem that you can't solve with Newtonian physics, even though for most everyday purposes, Newtonian physics is just fine. And the images here kind of show how that works. Sort of, most of space, actually Einstein's and Newton's is fairly similar. It's a sort of flat space for most of the area we're thinking of, but just as you get close to the Earth, it becomes a bit different. So there's this idea of the earlier theory mathematically approximating the later theory. The new theory does solve more problems, even though, as with the progress of science generally, we can expect there to be new problems, and today we haven't managed to reconcile relativity with quantum theory, for example. So we know there are still new problems. So the idea of structural realism is that what we can rely on here is the mathematical structure, or more generally, I think the relational structure is the relational structure that's we can be quite confident that we're gradually approximating towards more and more accurate views of the world. What does continue to shift through paradigms is ontology. So in Newtonian science, you have this specific conception of fixed space, whereas in Einsteinian physics, you have space-time. It's a completely different thing. Space and time are fundamentally connected. That's a different ontology. And in future physics, we may have a different ontology again. And so the idea of structural realism is that you can have an idea of approximating an accurate view of the structure of the universe while still accepting that there may be major ontological shifts that go along with that. So yeah, that's an idea that can be helpful for thinking about progress in metamodernism. And I guess just one more idea before we draw to a close that I think is relevant to understanding progress, again, coming from is that we can relate to the philosophy of science, is this idea of the social dimension of access to truth. So there's a sort of standard way of thinking about the progress towards metamodernism, which is that in modernism we have this idea of a sort of scientific activity that happens sort of independently of a social context and can just through its specific methods gain access to reality. And then the postmodern critique of science is that actually you have to look at the social context within which science is operating, and that undermines science and its claims to get access to objective reality, because everything scientists do is kind of influenced by the social norms and structures that envelop it. Whereas, so an idea that Storm articulates in his book Metamodernism is that we have to understand that socially constructed concepts are not necessarily barred from accessing reality. You can understand what he calls process social kinds as being at once socially constructed, but also giving us access to genuine social kinds, similar to natural kinds, while acknowledging that those social kinds also evolve, which is why they're called process social kinds. And this idea is interestingly similar to how philosophy of science developed after Kuhn in the Anglo-American tradition, where Kuhn basically opened the door to this really detailed investigation of how society influences scientific practice. There was something called the Strong program of scientific knowledge, of the sociology of knowledge, which really tried to reduce scientific knowledge to an understanding of those sort of larger social structures it was in. But then there were also critiques of that approach from people like Philip Kitcher, who looked at the way that certain specific social structures can actually enable a kind of objectivity despite. So yeah, it's again this idea of socially constructed knowledge being still genuine knowledge. And I think something like that is also required if we're going to have this idea of at least epistemological process, epistemological progress between paradigms. So there needs to be a combination of something like structural realism to say that actually there is this sort of real structure that is being uncovered, or we're getting increased knowledge of between paradigms. And we also have to understand the way in which the social structures we're operating in can be understood in such a way that in a non-relativistic way, so that it's not fully just different cultures are going to have different takes on the nature of reality. So yeah, that's basically it. I guess just this final slide is just about sort of situating what I've been talking about within a broader picture of metamodernism or second Renaissance. So I see this as a very much on the philosophical side of the side of things, so sort of conceptual underpinnings, you might say, of what it would mean for a paradigm to evolve and progress to a better paradigm. But of course, it doesn't address some of the other aspects of metamodernism, particularly around the spiritual, which is something I'm also interested in, or the aesthetic, or particular applications to political practice. So I just wanted to sort of acknowledge that in a way the limitations of what we've been talking about. There's a lot of other sort of very important questions here, but that's kind of how I'm situating it for the moment. So yeah, we'd love to hear people's thoughts. Great if we could have a kind of reflective dialogue rather than a sort of Q&A setting. So happy for people just to sort of share their thoughts, and yeah, either raise your hand or just jump in.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in really quick and offer, I guess, one thing to the discussion really quick. Let's see. I think you had mentioned that a lot of the times how paradigms evolve, it's because there are a lot of anomalies about things that we can't understand. And like these kind of build up. And I've heard this before, like these build up and then eventually kind of everyone realizes that there's something wrong with the way science is being done, or our models of the world, or the way we understand the world. So kind of jump to the next thing. And I think, well, I guess maybe I have 2 points. I think it is interesting how, I guess, with this maybe paradigm shift, it's not only about understanding, but it's kind of also about doing, or that like ontological part too. It's not just about our inability to understand the world, but it also has something to do with our inability to, I guess, self-maintain or self-renew in the world. So that's the first point. If you or anyone else has any comments in regard to that. And I guess the second part that kind of came up for me is that all, I guess, and maybe this is kind of implicit or obvious to everyone, but I guess all paradigm shifts are kind of unique in their own way. And I feel like this one is especially unique. But yeah, I guess those were just 2 thoughts that I had, and really, grateful for the presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, no, good points, Simon.
Okay, I'll jump in. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for all that stimulation. I mean, a couple of comments from a sort of similar position of philosophy of science and so forth. I mean, you mentioned that science does have some decent metrics of progress in the sense of explanatory power, in sense of accuracy of experimental prediction and so forth. And I do wonder, that makes me really reflect with skepticism about whether you can do the same for cultural evolution, cultural progress, paradigm shifts. That's on the one side. But on the other side, I'm coming back to one of my favorite people to cite, George Kelly, and personal construct theory, because I think that that even though Kelly was over 10 years younger than Thomas Kuhn, I mean, he had this idea of, he had a similar kind of idea, I think, of that you continue, that people, individuals and scientific groups, this is, I think, I mean, I'll extend it to scientific groups. I mean, connecting Kuhn and Kelly, you continue trying to make your current paradigm and worldview fit until it doesn't, until there comes a stage where you think, oh shit, it doesn't fit. And then that becomes a kind of crisis, a kind of revolution or whatever. And I think that's a very general pattern, which makes complete sense, because people are, by their very nature, intellectually lazy, because there's far too much to process anyway, and so we need to be economical with our thinking. So of course it makes sense to try and explain everything in terms of your current worldview, and then only when it becomes critical do you actually shift. And of course, if you're a dictator, then you surround yourself with people that agree with you, and therefore you never get that pressure to shift, which is why dictatorship is so dangerous. Yeah, a couple of just brief comments which you might want to answer or not, Jonah. I mean, like, I think you heard you saying something that socially constructed knowledge can be genuine knowledge, and I really don't know what you mean by genuine knowledge. I mean, what is ungenuine knowledge? You know, like what? And why shouldn't different cultures have different takes on reality? I mean, as far as I can see, of course, different cultures have different takes on reality, different ontologies. Well, maybe you didn't say that, so I'll perhaps leave it at that. But I think the main point is the main point which I have as a question is really, or I'd like to question is, like, I do see a clear metric of progress on the scientific front, because there is a scientific method and paradigm and so forth. Generally, overall scientific paradigm, let alone the paradigms within science. But I don't see that within cultural evolution.
Yeah, I mean, just to respond on that quick point about genuine knowledge. I guess I was just trying to avoid using the word objective again, because I think objective has specific connotations that I think what we're talking about is a bit broader than that. It's, you know, we call it true knowledge, or, you know, we do want to distinguish between knowledge in inverted commas, which is sort of knowledge relative to a specific culture, I think, because if that's the only kind of knowledge there is, then that's relativism and postmodernism. And metamodernism is trying to move beyond that. We want to have a hierarchy of types of knowledge, where we say actually some kind of knowledge is better. And this is very, I think it links to Johnny's point, right? About the impact for action and avoiding crises and catastrophes. That's an important kind of action that we're trying to achieve. Some kinds of knowledge are going to be better for that than others, right? And yeah, this ability to self-maintain as a culture is one way of sort of measuring the sort of more objective success of a knowledge paradigm. Yeah, Martin.
I was just going to mention something that might be relevant or not, but it's a take that there is no view that is capable of not being perspective of the worldviews. So paradigm is almost like a stake that certain individuals, in the course of engaging with the world and being scientifically present or occupying that field in the society, they stand behind it and they build behind that paradigm their social capital or the value they accrue. So there are two things here. One is phenomenon of denaturalization, when one view, which is a scientific paradigm, becomes so common sense that it's widely accepted by everyone. And what you call like birthing and these anomalies is almost like different people in that paradigm or in the totality of the field are almost taking certain adversarial roles in it. So I'm just saying that there are different aspects than purely functional or purely not fit for the solution, but there are constant social challenges to the hegemony of certain worldviews and therefore paradigms as well. Thank you.
Yeah, totally agree that there are different dimensions there that we need to consider. And I think it's also interesting to connect, going back to your point as well, Simon, about the difference between sort of cultural evolution and scientific evolution. I think thinking about technology is useful here as well. That a lot of people have argued that it's hard to distinguish technology from science, actually, and technological society from science. The activity of science involves exploring technological applications, and which then leads to technological ways of life. So I think that those two things have to be assessed together when we're talking about paradigm shifts. And yeah, that's the sort of bigger question that I didn't really discuss in my talk is what's our standard of evaluation there? I guess I was focusing on the sort of epistemological standard, like does it give us greater access to truth or knowledge, which I think is important. It's an important element of this. You want to say, part of what makes metamodernism better than postmodernism is that it's, in some sense, a truer view of what's really happening. But truth is not everything when it comes to assessing paradigms. You also have to think about practical implications for society and ways of life, and overcoming existential crises and elements of the polycrisis as well. So I think, yeah, that these various different dimensions that we want to assess paradigms on. Joe, yes, you can.
Yeah. I did it the old-fashioned way. So a couple of concepts seem to be getting conflated in my thinking here, and they are between paradigm and worldview, and the ontological and the epistemological, and specifically, I'm concerned about the changes, the shifts, those boundaries between old and new paradigms, if you will. And if we're, at least as I try to make societal change and shifts, how do we do that cohesively, or does it not have to be cohesively? So like I'm thinking of, almost like a phase transition or a phase shift. So that's an instantaneous shift from one state to another. But there's also nonlinear phase changes. And that seems to be a better, not a better, I don't want to put it in those words, but a way of looking at society in terms of integral or spiral dynamic terms. People and stages are at different levels of change. So we have a whole system where we're going to have partial changes in partial parts of a system, whereas we need the whole thing to shift. And so, like, I'm really interested in that boundaries between the phase changes or between the paradigmatic changes. And I, you know, it was a good presentation. It's got me thinking, and you know, that's why I came. So thank you for that.
Thanks. Yeah. Where we sort of got 10 minutes left, and I want to get other people to come in. So Rufus, I think you've had your hand up for a while, and then Johnny, and then Martin, maybe. Are you okay with your Rufus? Are you? Did you want to say something?
I do. There we go. I managed to find the unmute button. But well, great presentation, I think, and great dialogue. I just want to so much richness here. I'm almost lost because there's so many things to comment on that people have said that are great. Maybe just starting last with Joe's comment briefly. By the way, I mean phase change. I don't know what you mean by linear or non-linear. If you think of ice forming in water, funny enough, while it is a kind of fairly abrupt, looked at it in a kind of like at a temperature level, obviously there are little, if you actually look at it as a crystalline formation, you know, there are bits that start freezing and it kind of spreads, and it's not like zero, it's not boom, but it's like a smoother step function. It's not like a completely sharp step function. It's a more smooth S function, I'm sure. But I'm saying, I think that's actually a good analogy. Like, I think there's a deeper question, which is, in the future, does in a way modernity spread across the world in many ways for ill, not for good? You know, there was a lot of colonialism, conquest, imposition of modernity, or even people adopting modernity because they had to, because otherwise they'd be conquered or whatever. But just to say, we could imagine a future where somehow that cultural paradigm, there's people in different cultural paradigms, or even like a forking. So far, I mean, this is a big debatable question, because like there's the people who don't really even endorse cultural paradigms, but there's this aspect that if you are a globalized world, then probably people will sort of end up at least in a dominant social, you know, cultural onto social paradigm. So yeah, there's that point. I think the one thing that's funny, I just did want to remark on, is like almost everything in the core that now gets called metamodernism is basically integral. Like all spiral dynamics, you know, it's like, but somehow I don't get I sometimes don't get it. I mean, I guess you could say that's ironic, but I think I see metamodernism sometimes when I use it precisely, like in the Second Renaissance white paper, as describing the cultural paradigm. So it's a label, which integral also has been in that thing, although it's a bit more ambiguous. Is integral like this whole philosophy? But just to mention, I think most of these ideas really, they're there obviously before integral, but really, you know, I feel we need to do this more and acknowledge like integral and Wilber and that work, because it's kind of seminal. And you know, almost everyone here was, I mean, like certainly like Hansi Freinacht, they were both basically just took Wilber and applied it basically in some ways. Not to critique, but just say, I think I almost feel we need to write a paper. I need to write one just being like all my debts to integral and Wilber, so it's really clear. I think there's something that I want to end on, which Simon says, just in the dialogue, that I think this is sort of the debate, is that there is a sense of better, that we want to be careful of goodness, like the growth to goodness debate, right? There's this like, is more complex better? Obviously not. Like, is a whale better than an ant or better than a bacteria? What do you mean? It's more complex, a whale, but is it morally better or not? Not really. It's not clear. So, but then there are other ways where we do mean it. Like there's some ways in which in that tradition there's a sense of like the growth in our moral caring we kind of, in theory, if that's associated with cultural paradigms, that's a good thing, like moving from the group to humanity to the living or whatever. And I think we do want to confront that at some point. There's Kohlberg and there's Piaget, and they're related. But that one does not give the other. Like just being more cognitively complex does not mean you are a good person. And then that kind of ends, and like at least in Kuhnian paradigms, there was a sense, I guess, for Simon that it's better in the sense of it works better. There's some sense of it. Now, what does it work better at? Yes, but there's an idea in which Einstein is better than Newton because it explains more stuff. It can both do Newton and it can do more. And there's a situation where Newtonian physics will go wrong. So I think it's true. And one of the things we'll work out in this group is to be careful in our languaging. And I think we're at this point when kind of we're beyond the Nora Bateson grenade, of like stage theories of colonialism or something, and like, yeah, no, well, and also that having up does not mean we have the top. That was also a point which I think goes back a long way again before metamodernism of like, it's what they call relative utopias, but this idea that I can know upwards and know better, but don't mean I've got the best. But I just want to send, which is like great dialogue. I think people's input was amazing, and Jonah, fantastic presentation. Thank you. And over to you, Johnny.
Yeah, I echoed the thanks. I feel a bit nervous because I feel the discussion was quite a high quality, and I come into it knowing basically nothing about this area. So I'm just going to say some stuff, and I hope that's all right. So I was thinking, firstly, really nice presentation. It was really rich. It had a lot of kind of very well integrated arguments with quite a lot of stuff packed in. So thank you for that. I was thinking about paradigms, and I don't actually know what spiral dynamics and integral theory cover. My sense from this discussion is that it's something to do with like a kind of descriptive or explanatory model of social change, but that could be just completely wrong. Anyway, I felt like there's an important difference between cultural paradigms and scientific paradigms. So just to demonstrate with an example, I feel like something like the Enlightenment, which I haven't gone into in a lot of detail, but it seems to be kind of like quite a big societal shift away from like a religious worldview. I feel like that's very different to, say, a scientific paradigm shift, because I think science is a paradigm such that it's like a way of approaching things, a way of investigating a method. And then a paradigm shift that comes within science is still held within that broader meta framework. But something like the Enlightenment would be, it's at a meta level that the shift happens rather than kind of within it. I don't know if that makes any sense. Yeah. And secondly, a question about the point of what was presented. I guess I'm just curious as to, it's interesting as a description and potential explanation, but how does it help us? And what is it trying to help towards? I don't know, does it give some sort of tools? And then how do you interrogate the methods? How do you, I guess this links back to evaluation, but at a more kind of like moral compass level, how do you actually keep interrogating whether this is the right thing to be pushing or not? Okay.
Great, thank you. Yeah, no, really, really interesting points. I guess I'll just try and very quickly respond, and then we'll sort of move to checking out and just thinking about next time. But yeah, in terms of the meta paradigms, yeah, I think that's one way of looking at it. I think another way, and sort of Kuhn's way, is probably to say that actually even before Enlightenment, there was science going on, and yeah, science is a key part of the Enlightenment. But you've got Aristotelian science, and that's part of what justifies his talk of incommensurability of worlds, because Aristotelian science is so different from Enlightenment science. Right? That's actually part of what motivates his ideas of different worlds there. And yeah, I mean, it's a good question what it's for. I see it as just sort of helping us. I feel like it's a contentious issue, this idea of progress between paradigms, and it's kind of often assumed that there is some kind of progress, but it's not clear what kind of progress. And that's, yeah, basically what I was trying to do is see whether we can get help by mapping it onto some of these philosophy of science debates where there are actually similar questions. What is there progress in science? And what does it mean? What kind of progress? But yeah, I'll leave it there. Maybe we can stop the recording now, Lauren, and just have a sort of check out. So